Tagebuch aus dem Feldzuge in der Champagne 1792. The following presents the diary kept by a Hessian officer during that ill-fated campaign. The entries were recorded during the march and in the aftermath of battles, thus preserving the author's impressions with their original vividness. Hans Ephraim von Stamford was the son of Johann Ludwig Friedrich von Stamford and Suzette Moutelet, daughter of the Landgrave's court councillor, personal physician and professor, Dr. Moutelet of Kassel. The Moutelet family was among those Protestant families expelled from France in the 17th century. Hans was born in Hain on December 14th, 1766, where his father served as a staff captain in the regiment of Kniphausen. He was admitted to the Landgrave's cadet corps at an early age, and at 16 was commissioned as an ensign, the lowest officer rank at the time, in the Laib Infantry Regiment, which had been fighting for 6 years in British service against the rebellious American colonies. Under the watchful eye of his father, a major in the same regiment, who later, from 1786 to 1802, oversaw all Hessian military hospitals in Haina, the young officer experienced his baptism of fire and learned the art of war in a challenging theater of operations. The Americans' lack of familiarity with European military tactics and their deficiency in discipline gave rise to a new method of warfare, the so-called skirmish order, which would later be adopted under similar circumstances by the levies of the French Republic. The Hessian troops who had served in America brought valuable combat experience back home when they returned in 1784, experience that was largely absent among the armies of the great European powers when they formed their coalition to crush the French Revolution in 1792. The Allied war effort, however, was marred by disjointed interests and poor strategic leadership, ultimately leading to the defeat of their disciplined, tactically superior armies at the hands of the revolutionary forces, which were driven by ruthless determination. It is of particular interest to observe, through the diary of a participant in this infamous campaign, how the army's initial enthusiasm and fighting spirit gradually gave way to despondency. Yet for Hessians, there remains a sense of pride in knowing that their troops were virtually the only ones to emerge from this severe trial with their hard-earned reputation intact. The small leather-bound book was evidently carried on the author's person, most likely in the breast pocket of his uniform coat. It bears the marks of the rain, which in the autumn of 1792 proved as formidable an ally to the French as it was a bane to the invading army. The ink on many pages has faded, and numerous abbreviations, likely the result of the author's haste in writing, render some passages difficult to decipher. However, I believe I have faithfully reproduced the text with only minimal exceptions, preserving the author's intended meaning. Hans Ephraim von Stamford served as a premier lieutenant in the 1st Battalion of the Laib Infantry Regiment, which in 1792 was garrisoned in Kassel. May 13th. Orders have arrived directing us to march on June 20th toward the county of Hanau-Münzenberg. The Laib Regiment, comprising 2 battalions of 8 companies each, along with 4 field guns, commenced its departure from Kassel today. The 1st Battalion was quartered in Zennen, while the 2nd Battalion was billeted in Fritzlar for the night. May 14th. The regiment resumed its march, the 1st Battalion moving towards Sebetterode, while the 2nd Battalion advanced to Sachsenhausen. We remained in these quarters through the following day, allowing the men a brief respite. May 16th. At first light, we continued our movement. The 1st Battalion proceeded to Kolbe, while the 2nd Battalion reached Werda, just outside Marburg, the principal town of Upper Hesse. The roads were tolerable, though the terrain began to grow more uneven as we approached the foothills. May 17th. Our march led us through increasingly wooded country. The 1st Battalion traversed the dense Gleiberger forest before reaching Krofdorf, now within the Principality of Nassau-Weilburg. The 2nd Battalion pressed on to Rodheim, entering the lands of Darmstadt. The shifting boundaries of these small principalities are ever apparent, yet they bear little consequence to the weary soldier who is more concerned with the conditions of the road and the quality of his next billet. May 18th, a welcome day of rest. I seized the opportunity to ride to Gießen, a town of some note within the Darmstadt region, and from there to Gleiberg, a small but historic Nassau-Weilburg town. The fortress of Gleiberg, along with the ruins of Fetzberg and Wetterberg, once belonged to the Counts of Gleichen, but the Swedes laid them to waste during the ravages of the 30 Years' War. Of the three, only Gleiberg and Fetzberg still stand as ghostly relics of the past, while Wetterberg has been reduced to little more than an overgrown moat. From the heights of Gleiberg, the view is nothing short of breathtaking. One can survey a vast expanse of countryside, stretching the length of a full day's march in every direction. Here, during the late war, both French and Allied encampments could be observed, their lines spread across the valleys and ridges. May 19th. Breaking camp, we moved through Wetzlar, a town of imperial immediacy, before reaching the village of Dorlar, where we crossed the Lahn River. Our route took us next to Braunfels, a hilltop town dominated by its ancient castle, the seat of the princes of Solms-Braunfels. From Wetzlar, a well-constructed chaussee extends toward Weilburg, a town nestled in a picturesque valley. The approach is flanked by forests, and just before reaching Weilburg, the road narrows into a charming alleyway, serving as a promenade. Weilburg itself is striking. Perched upon a rocky outcrop that juts into the Lahn, the town clings to its natural defences. On the opposite bank, a sheer cliff rises, crowned by a majestic fortress, its modern additions blending with the ancient walls. The houses are solidly built, the streets well kept, and the air of prosperity is evident. From Weilburg we pressed on toward Limburg, a town under the electorate of Trier, garrisoned by several hundred French troops. Our passage through was made under cover of night, limiting what could be observed. However, I noted that the town sprawls in 3 sections along the Lahn, which it appears to embrace with its winding course. The river forced us to cross it twice before we could continue our march. Entering the Dietz region, we arrived at 3 a.m., dispersing into 6 villages surrounding Freiendietz for the night. My company, however, was ordered to press on through Dietz itself to Berrybach, extending our march to a grueling 16 hours. Dietz, though small, is delightfully situated at the base of a steep hill, crowned by an imposing castle. French cavalry were quartered in the town, their presence a reminder of the tenuous hold each side maintains over this contested land. Thus concluded our march for the week, with the regiment well positioned to continue toward our objective in the coming days. May 20th, we did not set out until 9 a.m., marching via Katzenelnbogen to our current cantonment quarters. The staff of the 1st Battalion was quartered in Zorn, with 1 company in Dickscheid and another in Neuroth. The staff of the 2nd Battalion was stationed in Weidebach, while 1.5 companies were sent to Niedermeilingen, another company to an unknown location, the manuscript does not specify, and the remaining 1.5 companies were quartered in Müncherod. May 22nd and 23rd were designated as days of rest. On May 24th, we resumed our spring exercises. The region known as the Blauländchen is elevated, harsh and infertile, covered with slate mountains. However, it boasts beautiful meadows, good forests, and many elderberry heaths. June 7th. The cavalry held a special review near Naastad. 2 days later, on June 9th, the following units were stationed: the Grenadier Battalion Prince von Philippsthal in Petersburg, the Garde Grenadiers in Hornig, the Leib Regiment and the Grenadier Battalion von Eschwege in Nauroth, the Dragoons in Kainen, and the Grenadier Battalion von Stein in Schwalbach. On the same day, our brigadier, Major General von Kudel, passed away in Zorn. June 10th, per company, 1 non-commissioned officer and 15 men of the regiment stationed in the county of Katzenelnbogen were granted leave to Hessen. On June 12th, Serenissimus held a review in Hanau, and General Kudel was buried with full military honours. The next day, each infantry battalion in the lower county of Katzenelnbogen granted leave to 15 men per company. June 16th, several troop movements took place. The Garde marched from Rheinfels to Hanau, while the Grenadier Battalion Prince von Philippsthal moved to Dönigheim and Kesselstadt. Prince Karl's battalion relocated to Bach and Somborn, and the Grenadier Battalion von Wurmb was sent to Bernbach and Altenmittlau. The Gendarmerie Cavalry Regiment was stationed in Hergen, Wilbel, Breungesheim, and Eckenheim in the county of Hanau. Meanwhile, the Prince Friedrich Dragoons returned to Hessen, settling in Kirchhain, Gross, and Klein-Sielheim. The Garde du Corps detachment moved to Hanau along with the Garde. The Grenadier Battalion von Eschwege took over the quarters vacated by the Prince von Philippsthal Battalion, and the Grenadier Battalion von Stein relocated from Schwalbach to Sprengen. On the same day, Premier Lieutenant Ritter, formerly a brigade adjutant stationed with the Leib Regiment, suffered a tragic accident when he fell into a shaft at headquarters and broke his neck. June 17th, I travelled to Rheinfels. The following day, the Leibdragoner Regiment took over the quarters vacated by the Garde Dragoon Regiment in Nastedt. That same day, I travelled to Oberwesel, Kaub, and Pfalz, then sailed down the Rhine in the evening. As these places are well known and often described, I will not go into further detail. June 19th, I visited Cats and Mouse Castles and returned to my quarters. During the day, I also had the opportunity to see Prince Condé. The following day, another 15 men per company were granted leave. I travelled to Schwalbach and Schlangenbad. June 25th, an additional 30 men per company were granted leave, reducing our effective strength to just 8 non-commissioned officers, 2 drummers, and 30 privates. 2 days later, we received orders that we were being returned to peacetime establishment, making it unlikely that we would see campaign action. On June 28th, orders were given to march back to Hanau. June 29th, a counter-order was issued, directing all units to remain in their current quarters in the lower county of Katzenelnbogen. The regiments stationed in the county of Hanau were ordered to remain ready to march at a moment's notice, while baggage was to remain in Rheinfels for the time being. June 31st, the Elector of Trier passed through Rheinfels and was greeted with a 90-gun salute. I was transferred from Nauroth to Weidenbach under Major von Motz. July 10th, orders from Kassel, dated July 6th, were received. July 3rd, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, the hero of the 7 Years' War, passed away at the age of 71. It seemed as though he was not meant to witness the military campaign of his nephew, who was departing for the army. All furloughed cavalry troops stationed along the Main and Rhine were placed under the command of Christian von Stahl, while those from the infantry fell under General Major von Kochenhausen. Upon receiving general orders to reassemble, the cavalry troops were to gather in Berg and Melsungen, the hussars in Grabenstein, and the dragoons in Homburg and Kirchhain. The infantry was to assemble in their respective regimental garrisons in Hessen, while the artillery, Jäger, and light infantry were to gather in Segenhain and Treise. All furloughed soldiers would be escorted back to their regiments by officers assigned from the troops that had remained in Hessen. July 17th, a cartel was established between Electoral Trier and Hessen Castle. The Prussians began marching toward Koblenz on July 15th. The Imperial Austrian forces advanced to Kehl, while the French royalist émigrés assembled at Hingen. The King of Sardinia advanced with 30,000 troops alongside 11,000 Austrians toward Nice. Austrian forces moved into the Netherlands. Spain deployed troops to the Pyrenees. Bavaria, the Swabian Circle, and the Upper and Lower Rhenish circles contributed troops to the Imperial Army contingent. Meanwhile, the French celebrated their national day, July 14th, relatively peacefully. July 20th, an Imperial War Council was held in Mainz. Emperor Francis II, who had been crowned on July 14th in Frankfurt, met in Mainz with the King of Prussia, who travelled via Ansbach from Berlin. The three ecclesiastical prince-electors, the Duke of Brunswick, the French princes, and the Landgrave of Hessen-Kassel. During the War Council, the French royalist émigrés were required to pledge allegiance to the new emperor as their protector, except for Prince Condé, uncle of the King of France, who was arrested. Count Wittgenstein, head of the Wittgenstein Legion within the émigré forces, had been imprisoned in Ehrenbreitstein fortress a few days earlier for engaging in treasonous correspondence with the French revolutionaries. July 22nd. Today, the King of Prussia and the Duke of Brunswick travelled down the Rhine. The king continued to Schönborn's Lust, a pleasure palace belonging to the Elector, situated on the far side of the Rhine near Koblenz. Meanwhile, the Duke of Brunswick took quarters in Horchheim, a village on the near side of the river. As the king passed by Fortress Rheinfels, he was honoured with a salute of 100 cannon shots. Later in the day, I took the opportunity to visit a Roman redoubt known as the Ring, which, according to historical records, dates back to the time of Varus. It is located on a hill near Wildert, a village in Weilburg territory. I then explored the ruins of the Alte Burg, the ancestral seat of the Counts of Nassau. Little remains of it now, with only a few scattered remnants marking its existence. From there, I went to examine the Wulferscheider Spring, a newly discovered mineral spring with a high iron content, bubbling forth from slate rock formations. The spring is located in a narrow valley, surrounded by slate quarries and caves, adding to the intrigue of the landscape. I also visited the Werdener Spring, which lies within Mainz's jurisdiction. Its water has a particularly pleasant taste and is found in another narrow valley not far from Wildorf. Before returning, I made my way south to Weilburghof, also known as Riedlershof. Just a few days ago, a fierce thunderstorm struck there, injuring a woman and killing a cow. The signs of the storm's impact were still visible, serving as a reminder of nature's sudden and unpredictable fury. July 23rd. Order from Wilhelmshöhe, July 21st. A troop corps has been designated to join the Prussian army stationed along the Rhine under my command. The following regiments and corps have been assigned to this task: the Carabinier Regiment, Lieb Dragoon Regiment, Hussar Regiment, and 11 squadrons. For infantry, the Guard, Guard Grenadiers, Lieb Regiment, the Grenadier battalions of Prince Philippsthal and Eschwege, 8 battalions in total, 2 companies of Jäger, and 2 companies of light infantry. The regimental artillery is also included. All troops are to recall their vacationing soldiers immediately, in strict adherence to the order from July 6th. Oberstleutnant von Eschwege from the Guard Regiment is ordered to go to Kassel to gather the vacationing infantry soldiers. The remaining cavalry and infantry stationed along the Rhine and Main will march back to Hessen to their respective garrisons by July 2nd, except for the 1st Battalion of the Hereditary Prince's Regiment, which will go to Kassel, and the Grenadier Battalion of Wurmb, which will march to Marburg. By August 15th, everything must be in a state of readiness to march. Officers will receive 1 month's allowance and must procure their horses. The War College will immediately take care of the pack and wagon horses, field commissariat, and hospital provisions. The vacationing soldiers of the infantry are to assemble in Marburg, Hirschfeld, and Hanau. The generals assigned are von Biesenroth, von Dalvik, von Wurmb, von Haustein, and Lemp. June 26th, Lieutenant von Malespina from the artillery and Fähnriche, Hering, and Wolf from the hereditary Princes Jäger Corps were transferred. Lieutenant Hausen was reassigned from the artillery regiment, Goebel from the 2nd Battalion of Berg, and Fähnriche, Wetzel, and Harter from the Prince Karl Regiment to the light infantry. July 27th, on command, Colonel Dubai from the Prince Karl Regiment exchanged positions with Colonel von Hanstein from the Leib Regiment. Major von Donop from the Regiment von Kospoth swapped with Major von Bohlen from the Guard Grenadier Regiment. Additionally, orders were issued regarding the ration supplies. August 3rd. The unessential personnel of the marching corps were exchanged with the available personnel from the regiments in Hessen. August 5th. Order from Hanau. August 4th. It was announced to the corps that by the 16th they would move to the next quarters near Rheinfels. August 7th. Until further orders, we are to remain in our current quarters. Today, the Prussian army set out from Koblenz to Trier. August 10th. A decree was issued informing the soldiers that deserters would not receive pardon under any circumstances. August 11th. The strictest subordinations order was announced today. August 12th. Colonel von Kreutzberg was ordered to report as a liaison officer to the Prussian headquarters. His Jäger Corps was placed under the command of Colonel Lenz, and Major von Motz from the Leib Regiment was ordered to command it. The Light Infantry Battalion immediately sent its 2 ammunition carts to the arsenal at Rheinfels. August 13th. On the 10th, we finally set off, were mustered at St. Goar, and our regiment spent the night in the villages of Urbach-Niederburg and Damschied, located in the Trier district of Oberwesel. August 16th, early at 4 a.m., the Leib regiment departed from its various cantonments in the county of Katzenelnbogen. We gathered at Lautert, formed up for a parade at St. Goar for muster, and then crossed the Rhine. We continued our march to the first night quarters, with the staff heading to Urbach, 2 companies and 3 companies to Damschied, and the 2nd Battalion to Niederburg in the Trier district of Oberwesel. August 17th. We continued our march over the following days. The staff and the 1st Battalion arrived at Kirscheid in the district of Simmern. 2 companies marched to Braunshorn, one to Dudenroth, owned by Count Metternich, and the remaining ones to Laubach. The 2nd Battalion remained in Simmern. A limited forage allowance was announced for the corps. August 18th. At 4 a.m. we marched again, passing Simmern and Kirchberg, which belonged to the Margrave of Hayden. This was the last town we passed before reaching Trier. From there we moved on to Dillendorf, where 2 companies stayed, and then to Dill, which had once been the residence of the Counts of Sponheim, now part of Baden. The 2nd Battalion remained here, with the remaining companies continuing to Gössenroth, owned by Count Salm-Grumbach, about 4 miles from Trarbach. The staff, with 3 companies of the 1st Battalion, went to Laufersweiler, a village in Trier. The headquarters were in Busch-Begen. August 19th, rest day. The weather was too poor to explore the area. August 20th, at 4 a.m. we set off. Our regiment gathered at the Stumpen Tower, which was probably a former watchtower from the castle Blankenberg in the valley below. Here, our baggage and artillery were placed under the protection of a strong command. The troops then moved leftward, passing Umbach and descending from the High Birke near Neuhof to the main road, continuing through the Heide to our quarters. We marched straight along a valley, with a dense forest on the left side stretching for 4 miles, passing through woods and heathland, up and down hills, without seeing any villages. The area was wild and barren until we reached Budlich and Thalfang. After Haag, 8 companies marched forward, with 2 companies heading to Merscheid, where the ruins of the former Hunstein castle were visible. The 2nd Battalion continued to Grebenthrow, with 3 companies of the 1st Battalion and the staff reaching Berg. The main headquarters were at Thalfang. This area was very rough, entirely mountainous, with poor, unattractive and dirty inhabitants. The houses, often built from schifferstein, resembled prisons. August 21st. The march today was just as exhausting as yesterday. However, the regiment entered a slightly more pleasant area. The staff and 2 companies of the 1st Battalion reached Kassel, while 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion and 1 company of the 1st Battalion moved to Waldrach. Both villages were situated in a beautiful valley full of vineyards, which opened up toward the Moselle for about 1.5 miles. The houses here were better built, and there was more prosperity. Unfortunately, this did not benefit us much, as the emigrants who had been in this area for the last 14 days had already consumed all available supplies. We had to be very frugal on the entire march, and anything we could still obtain had to be paid for at a high price. The main headquarters were in Trier at the Abbey of St. Maximilian. August 22nd. The regiment gathered at Rouer, a small village near the mouth of the described valley, just 100 steps from the Moselle. We then resumed our march along the chaussee that comes from Koblenz, with the Moselle on our right and vineyards on the left, which gradually receded, opening up into a wide field before Trier. 1 hour before reaching the city, across the Moselle, stood the former electoral residence, called Pfalzel, now a chapter house. Here the Berlin fields began, where the entire corps assembled and in column formation marched through the city in perfect order. The baggage followed the corps. Just before the city, on the left side of the chaussee, was the very wealthy and beautifully constructed Abbey of St. Maximilian, with its suburb, and across the Moselle, St. Bernard, at the foot of a mountain. Trier is laid out in a square, with beautiful high walls, and is entirely flat. The entrance is through a Dominican abbey, built in the Gothic style, which indicates its great age. At the left of the gate in the city is a house with a painted bas-relief of St. John the Baptist in colossal size. The city boasts many beautiful public buildings and elegant houses. However, the inhabitants on average are extremely unattractive and dirty, especially the women, and the streets are filled with a discernible number of fat priests from various orders. The marketplace is spacious, and the main guardhouse there is a charming building with an arcade. Outside the gate, on the left of the road, is a French bakery, and after passing several suburbs, 1.5 hours later, we reached the Abbey of Saint Maria. Another hour further, across the river on the right, was the country residence of the current governor of Trier, which he had established, surrounded by an Italian poplar grove. Another hour later, on the left side of the chaussee, stood the Carthusian monastery, with high walls and an impressive front building, housing a large Prussian depot, while a small French detachment was stationed nearby, both guarded by Trier military. An hour before Trier, the mountains on the left reconnect with the Moselle and continue to the Carthusian monastery near Merzlich, where the landscape opens up into a wide plain toward the Konzer Bridge, where the Saar flows into the Moselle. After crossing the bridge, we followed the chaussee to the right over a stone bridge and ascended through the valley along the Moselle, marching along a dirt road with the Moselle to the right and the Saar to the left. The view from the bridge is spectacular, showing the Moselle below, with all the previously described locations visible, including many villages, monasteries, and the mountains beyond Trier. This view is extremely interesting, and just past the bridge the mountains resume, and we were constantly ascending until we reached our camp at Tabern and Fellerich, passing through the village which covered our left flank. This was secured by a detachment from the Grenadier Battalion of Eschwege, which was performing a flanking maneuver. The infantry front faced the Mannebacher Grund, with the right wing touching a forest and the cavalry behind us, an hour away, their right flank covered by us and their left by a forest. Light infantry was stationed at Kummern and Mannbach, patrolling along the front. Cavalry posts were stationed at both wings to cover our rear, forming a chain of posts. 3 infantry commands stretched along the Mannebacher Valley from Tabern to Fellerich, covering our front. This position is at the border of the Duchy of Luxembourg or the Spanish Netherlands. Our communication with Trier is covered by a command at the Konzer Bridge and a post chain near Illingen, which patrols towards Wobenen. The Prussians are stationed at Diedenhofen, and their position extends across the Moselle at Grevenmacher, where they have a pontoon bridge defended by 800 emigrants and a Prussian detachment with a pontoon depot. The French émigré army is stationed at the town of Billich along the Moselle. Grevenmacher is a charming little town across the Moselle at the foot of a mountain. The Moselle remains navigable here. On both sides of the town, right on the river banks, the Prussians are stationed on the right and 800 emigrants on the left. I had the guard duty on the same day, July 22nd, which was extremely difficult due to the continuous downpours, and we had neither straw nor wood nor proper cover. Moreover, the little that came for sale in the camp was horrendously expensive. August 21st. Thunderstorms followed by more storms and heavy rain. Our horses, unaccustomed to such conditions, became ill, and we also lacked forage, especially good quality. The nights were so cold that we had to put on our thick coats. August 24th. Nothing remarkable occurred. Several suspicious French individuals were arrested and taken beyond the outposts. August 25th. Colonel von Worm returned. August 26th. A Prussian officer, Major von Huchel, arrived as adjutant at our headquarters, accompanied by a Prussian field jäger, who confirmed that Longwy, a fortress on the Lorraine border, was now in Prussian hands. The commander had initially vowed to defend the fortress to the utmost when the Prussian general made his request. However, the Prussian, assuring him that he was no longer fighting for a free king, but to demonstrate his loyalty to a true king rather than the demagogues, persuaded the commander. Influenced by the locals' efforts to surrender and the seriousness of the situation, the commander decided to hand over the fortress. It was also reported that Lafayette had been captured by Austrian forces in Namur. He had been pursued by 4 assassins employed by Jacobins. In response, he and several other generals fled with plans to escape to America, well funded for the journey. The assassins were apprehended and hanged, but Lafayette fled. After being questioned by Austrian outposts, he was forced to identify himself and was transported to Namur. August 27th. We received orders to depart tomorrow. Our forward sharpshooters have already been dispatched to the pontoon bridge at Grevenmacher. 1 detachment is sent to Konzer Bridge for bread and forage, while another heads to the War Commissariat. Our march will proceed toward Luxembourg, where we are to join Köhler's column, coming from Remich. We will leave our camp tomorrow. August 28th. We departed at 4 a.m. and marched over the pontoon bridge across the Moselle, set up by the Prussians, through Grevenmacher and along the highway to our camp at Annweiler. Today, a corps of mounted Jäger from the aristocratic Cognac unit had bivouacked there. We passed French forces in every village along the way. Our camp is a parade ground, with no significant issues regarding its convenience. We are facing the direction from which we came, toward Auweiler and the road from Trier through to Luxembourg. Our cavalry is positioned on the right flank, near a hill, with the left flank secured. August 29th. General march began at 5 a.m. We pass through the fortified suburbs of Luxembourg. The route ascends with fortifications to the left and a deep valley to the right. 2 rocks and a vineyard are visible in the foreground. The valley through which a small river flows divides into 2 parts. The central rock is barren, while the one on the left features an arcade at its foot with a barracks and some mills. In the middle of the valley is a mountain tongue with a wooden magazine, connected to the hill by a drawbridge. The tongue is decorated with terraces, and in front of it rises a very high hill where the main fortifications are located. To the left, the actual fortifications rise, while additional works extend along the length of the hill on the right. These works can be reached by passing through the first suburb on a steep chaussee, followed by a second suburb and into the open field. The city lies to the right, and this entire view is magnificent, though the fortress is commanding from this vantage point. Through this march, we made a significant detour, having to completely bypass the city. Nothing struck me more than the many cliffs, both naturally and artificially fortified, and then the sight of the Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, who rode alongside us on horseback. He is an old gentleman extraordinarily corpulent, wearing a short, tightly fitted coat. Never have I seen a more ridiculous-looking person. We continued for 2 more hours and reached our camp near Depac, situated on a beautiful open field that stretches all the way to Longwy. From the top of the hill, the field looks like a small woodland. We had an oblique front toward Luxembourg with the cavalry behind us. August 30th. We marched along the chaussee beside this field until we reached the Austrian-Dutch border, where the road veers to the right and the valley climbs steeply. In the valley there is a lovely estate, and along the chaussee a village. The first French territory we encountered was marked by the sight of a white flag flying from the city tower of Longwy, neither Prussian nor imperial, but the flag of France. Thus it was merely a conquest for the King of France. August 31st, I inspected the town, making the above observations, and made the acquaintance of a Madame Bernard and her 2 sisters, 3 charming and attractive ladies in whose company I thoroughly enjoyed myself. The vanguard, consisting of light infantry, hussars, and Jäger, advanced today along the road to Verdun to secure the route. The hussars pushed forward to within an hour's march of the town, while a company of light infantry was sent to Châtillon-l'Abbé, and 1 company of Jäger to Longuyon, a small town on the little river Austin. The rest of the detachment was dispersed elsewhere. September 1st. A squadron of dragoons, along with the grenadier battalions Prince von Philippsthal and von Eschwege of the Guard, advanced in support. The von Eschwege battalion proceeded to Marville, a small town on the river Austin, September 4th. Today we learned that Verdun had capitulated. Consequently, we received orders to advance. September 5th. We executed the order and established our camp near Dun, with our right flank positioned along the chaussee. September 6th. Our march continued through this small town, advancing along the chaussee. We passed the magnificently built and once wealthy abbey of Châtillon, whose clerical residents had been driven out by the mob. Their buildings, along with their furnishings, had been plundered and reduced to ruins, with only the bare walls remaining. A wealthy private individual had since acquired the remnants of this former splendor, along with the surrounding lands. However, last night, whether through the wantonness of a light infantry detachment stationed there or the carelessness of its new owner, this monument to mob fury was reduced to a heap of ashes by fire. From this abbey, looking to the right up the valley, one has a view stretching far along the road toward Marville. The valley is entirely planted with poplars. Our camp lay 12 hours' march further on a hill behind the village of Pilon. The right wing extended diagonally toward Boulogne, while the left bent backward across the highway, facing Stenay. The Leibdragoner were stationed on this flank, while the right was supported by the carabiniers. This position secured communication between the Austrians before Montmedy and the Prussians before Verdun and Thionville, while also covering the supply route from Longwy. As early as September 4th, the Prussians at Thionville had been reinforced by 30,000 Austrians, yet neither this town nor Montmedy had yet surrendered. Consequently, both armies transported heavier siege artillery. The Prussians at Verdun likewise did the same in preparation for the siege of Metz. Thus, supplies of all necessities continued to arrive daily. September 8th. At 1 a.m., the Duke sent an order to march via a Feldjäger, which was carried out at 6 a.m. The light troops that had remained behind first passed through our lines, after which we continued advancing along a fine chaussee. Our new position was 2 hours' march from Verdun, where we were now only 1.5 hours' distance from the main Prussian army, which extended westward from the city, stretching over 2 hills. September 9th. His Serene Highness paid a visit to His Majesty the King of Prussia, who had taken up quarters in the outskirts of Verdun. The inhabitants of the countryside in the government of Champagne are extremely poor. Most wear wooden shoes and have fewer luxuries than we do. Unfortunately, they even suffer from a shortage of salt, which is monopolized and mixed with saltpeter. Their situation has worsened since the revolution, and now due to the marauding of various passing armies, they are even more destitute. The land itself is highly fertile, with vast productive fields, but the peasants are burdened with excessive taxes. Their provincial dialect is very difficult to understand. There are many beautiful views, though they lack the majestic character of our landscapes, where ancient ruins enhance the scenery. Not far from here, a corps of imperial troops under General Clerfayt is positioned. September 10th. Today we received orders to march tomorrow. It is likely that we will join the main Prussian army stationed at Verdun. I suspect we are preparing for a battle against Monsieur Dumouriez, who is positioned 5 hours from Verdun near Mont, with 60,000 men. It is good that something decisive is finally being undertaken, as winter is approaching with the worst omens of autumn. Moreover, we cannot remain here. Everything has been consumed. The Prussians are also on the move. September 11th and 12th. The Duke attempted to outflank the French at Clermont by attacking their left wing. To this end, General Clerfayt, who had been positioned on our right flank at Verdun, advanced, while the Duke, having made all necessary preparations for the siege of Metz, deceived the enemy with this maneuver. The French realized the ruse in time, but despite being heavily entrenched, they fled in complete disorder. They left behind a corps to cover their retreat, but these troops soon followed suit, fleeing so hastily that the Prussian light troops captured cannons and prisoners. The French had no proper magazines either, relying instead on requisitions from the villages. September 13th. Our march continued to Sillery-la-Biche along the road to Clermont, where we arrived without significant opposition. The countryside is, as expected, marked by desolation and an ever-present sense of tension. Although we have seen no sign of the enemy thus far, we remain alert as there are reports of French forces nearby. The local population's resistance to the imperial troops is growing increasingly evident. As the towns and villages continue to be looted and stripped by various passing armies, resentment toward the Imperials is palpable. The civilians show a preference for the Prussians and Hessians over their current occupiers, but the aristocrats, whom they view as the true oppressors, remain their primary target. On a more personal note, the unrelenting cold and unpleasant weather have taken a toll on both morale and health. There is an unsettling chill in the air, compounded by the frost that arrived last night making the already harsh conditions even more uncomfortable. Even those who are accustomed to colder climates feel the sting of this bitter change. As for the soldiers, despite the difficult terrain and the occasional skirmish with lingering French forces, their discipline remains intact. The advance is slow but steady, and the army seems to be in good spirits, despite the hardships. There is a general feeling of anticipation as we approach Clermont, knowing that the French forces may yet make a stand there. September 14th. We reached the outskirts of Clermont today. It appears that the French are preparing to defend their position, though their strength is still uncertain. Our reconnaissance suggests that the French forces have fortified their position and are readying for battle. The Duke's orders are clear: prepare for a confrontation, as this may be the decisive clash we've been waiting for. The artillery is being moved into place, and our forces are drawn up in anticipation. It seems that the weather will be a key factor in the upcoming battle. The cold, damp conditions are making it difficult to maintain proper movement and communication between units. However, this does not seem to have dampened the resolve of the men. Everyone is ready to face what lies ahead, with a growing sense that the time for decisive action is upon us. September 15th. Battle is imminent. The French forces are well entrenched, but we are confident in our superior positioning and strength. Our artillery has been set up and the infantry is prepared for action. The Duke has given the signal, and the preparations are complete. We now wait for the battle to unfold. Whether it stems from kindness of heart or political strategy, the King's decision is remarkable. All prisoners of war are being released and sent home. September 13th. The stormy weather delayed our departure until noon. Afterward, we marched toward Vrancourt on the Ferret, about an hour from Clermont, where we established our camp. Upon arriving, we discovered that the French had abandoned the town and retreated into the mountains. They are now entrenched, likely 20,000 to 30,000 strong, in a heavily wooded area that serves as the pass into Champagne. Clermont, though an open town, is strategically positioned near several elevated locations, making it well suited for defense against infantry alone. It is thus surprising that the French withdrew without a fight. Our light troops were able to occupy the town with little resistance. The French retreat leads us to a formidable position. Their entrenched camp is situated high in the mountains, with sheer cliffs and dense forests surrounding it on both sides, making an attack impractical. The only viable route is the chaussee, which passes through the village of Les Isles. The French have heavily fortified this village, and the road ascends steeply toward their positions at the top of the hill, where they have established their camp, effectively preventing any potential retreat or advancement on our part. At the top of the chaussee, they have set up an artillery battery, and another battery is positioned further ahead in the forest. The road itself is barricaded with abatis, and several points on both the right and left have been cut off, further complicating any potential maneuvering. Given the difficulty of the terrain and the strong French positions, an immediate assault is out of the question. We will need to consider alternative strategies to break their hold on this position, but for now, we are forced to bide our time, knowing that any attempt to advance would be met with heavy resistance. It is remarkable that we did not secure this position immediately, especially considering the advice given during the siege of Verdun. Dr. Ponstan, in his comprehensive description of the terrain, had emphasized the absolute necessity of occupying it. However, the Duke took this counsel too lightly, and the French, with their 12,000 men, quickly entrenched themselves in the area. Our current progress can be likened to that of irregular troops, charging through the countryside, raiding and plundering everything to our right and left. This is a necessity, as we have no magazines behind us to supply provisions. Meanwhile, we leave critical fortresses, like Longwy and Verdun, behind us, weakly garrisoned despite their strategic importance in securing our communication with Luxembourg. To make matters worse, we have been releasing prisoners only to reinforce our enemies. If we are ever pushed back, we will face starvation and, in addition, be slaughtered by the peasants in revenge for our pillaging. In fact, a Kaiserliche Hussar has already met such a fate, and a French peasant even hacked a Hessian garde du corps in the hand. September 14th, the Prince of Hohenlohe took his position to the right, beyond the village of Anvervilliers. Today, we received news that General Clerfayt had successfully captured the post at Saint-Croix, although he was almost driven out by the enemy who mounted a rally. However, the French were eventually repulsed. They left many casualties on the battlefield, including the Prince of Ligne. Afterward, the French retreated to Saint-Menehould, where a portion of the corps that had previously withdrawn from Clermont was also stationed. The French, who are currently holding the passes of Clermont or La Côte de Biesme under Mr. Dillon, the brother of the officer who was defeated by the imperial forces 2 miles from Longwy at the village of, and subsequently captured by the National Guard, are now confronted by the advance guard of the army at Saint-Menehould, led by Mr. Dumouriez. At Chalons, the Parisians are stationed, and Kellermann is said to be on the move. Today, the Prussian artillery was placed on a hill across from the French artillery at Clermont without any disturbance. The grenadier battalions of Prince Philippsthal and von Eschwege occupy all the enemy's access points, with light infantry and Jäger positioned at Clermont. Additionally, 100 Prussian hussars and dragoons, who had joined our hussars since September 12th, occupy the village of Vrancourt. This village, along with Courel on the right and Hauteville on the left, lies along the banks of the Aire and has bridges that are guarded by infantry commands. The Aire flows through the valley between our front and the imperial lines. September 15th. I arrived at Vrancourt on command. On this day, Archduke Charles, brother of the Emperor, who is with Prince Hohenlohe's corps, along with Prince Liechtenstein and myself, observed the positions from a high rock at the foot of which Clermont lies. The outposts were a bit more active today. 2 deserters came in. During the night, the French tried to position themselves on a hill to better advance and shell our battery, but they were driven off by our troops. September 16th. The French made another attempt, but their outposts were inconvenienced by ours. They soon withdrew, suffering 2 dead and 3 captured, while we suffered no losses. The previous evening we had advanced several thousand paces to align with the imperial troops. There is still no word on how far the Duke has advanced. The imperial forces are reported to be at Saint-Inay. I have no clear idea of this operation's purpose. The Duke bypasses Reims to the right and moves straight towards Saint-Menehould, as if the French were to storm or overrun Longwy and Verdun, both of which are very poorly garrisoned. If we were to proceed this way, we would be in enemy territory, without a fortified position, magazine, or any way to sustain ourselves, completely cut off from the Rhine, Moselle, and Maas. September 17th, the Prince of Hohenlohe carried out a reconnaissance, stationed 2 imperial battalions in the forest, and bombarded the French camp. Prince Philippsthal was relieved by our 2nd battalion and took up his position on our right flank. The Grenadier battalion of Eschwege was relieved by a detachment from our corps and took its position behind the city of Clermont, where it constructed 2 redoubts on either side of the main road. September 18th. I returned from the field watch. The French attempted to sneak up on our outposts, but they found them always alert. Through constant work throughout the night, they were able to finish their fortifications. September 19th. Once again I went to Vraincourt on command. The French advanced with their outposts, prompting a cannonade from both sides. We had 1 man wounded. September 20th. We heard a heavy cannonade from far ahead. September 21st. Since the Duke had intended to break the French position at Saint-Ménehould today, but we were ordered to launch an attack on La Côte de Biémez, we advanced. However, when the cannonade suddenly stopped, we believed the Duke had achieved his goal. If he had caught Mr. Dillon in the rear, and we had managed to encircle him in the front, our attack would have been unnecessary. Dillon would either have had to break through or attempt to make his way through the forest to Mousson at the cost of his baggage, or he would be forced to surrender as a prisoner of war. We were further convinced of this when a Prussian field jäger reported the Duke's position behind Saint-Ménehould. As a result, we remained inactive and only the outposts were alarmed. When the cannonade resumed in the distance, our entire corps moved forward, and the cannonade became so intense that the batteries began to fire at each other. We could not launch an attack as the terrain allowed for only a very narrow front. The forest was impassable, and even if we pushed forward, we might not gain anything, even if an entire army was put at risk. Even if we captured the village, we would be buried under its ruins from enemy bombs. Furthermore, the approach for an attack was impossible, as the mountain was too high and the country road was too interrupted for us to bring cannons up to support. Thus, we had to abandon the assault, especially as night began to fall and bad weather set in. That night, we took up a new position along the highway on the right flank, but bent backward. Despite having our light troops, grenadier battalions, and posts, we stood for an hour and a half under the most intense cannonade, suffering only 2 dead, right behind SM, possibly targeted by enemy fire. Prince Philipsthal was posted partly in front of the city and partly quartered in Clermont, while Eschwege returned to his old position and the commands took their usual posts, including the light troops. September 21st. The bullets flew like a hailstorm behind us as we withdrew, but we sustained no damage. A deserter who arrived the following day assured us that the enemy had inflicted considerable damage with their fire. In general, the enemy's light troops seemed to harbour a fierce animosity toward ours, as they kept harassing us. We had 2 dead and 1 wounded, and our patrols often found dead soldiers in the woods. Yesterday we found an officer who was still alive but died within minutes. September 21st. I had to remain at the position we had reoccupied on the 20th. I rode to Clermont to visit the residence of Prince Condé, who owned this part of Luxembourg. However, his income was mortgaged to the King of France in exchange for a loan. One can see here, as in the surrounding area, the true consequences of an army without magazines, living off plunder. The people have barely any bread, and everything is mishandled by the various troops, even the Democrats. The girls, however, are mostly beautiful and sociable. In the evening, a sortie was attempted, but was repelled. September 22nd. We learned that the Duke had failed in his objective and had been met with fierce resistance, being pushed back. He had maintained his position, but lost many men during the attack. Therefore, we also continued to observe. I was sent on command to Courcelles. A spy informed us that the French were planning a sortie that night, so our regiment had to advance, but nothing came of it. We also learned that General Kellermann had marched out of Metz and was preparing to either confront the Duke or attack Verdun. September 23rd. A Prussian battalion and our grenadier battalion from Eschwege were detached. Prince of Philipsthal occupied our abandoned post at Clermont. The Imperial Army at Neuvillers intended to take the position we had left on September 20th. but the corps of emigrants that had arrived on the same day did not succeed in retaking the imperial position. I had to immediately take command and go on field duty. In general, due to the many duties and the sick, we are under such heavy service that it's hard to find even an hour of rest. We are now working covertly on a battery designed to dismantle the enemy's position. September 24th, nothing new. The weather is extremely poor. We have also already felt the consequences of this bad summer. Over 100 horses have perished in our corps, and every day the number rises. The French will pay for this. They will lose their horses as well. In all the surrounding villages, Trier, Luxembourg, Longwy, Longuyon, Verdun, and God knows where else, we have many sick. I don't know if any of them were among the auditeurs who died. September 25th, continuous storm and rain. Clermont, as previously mentioned, lies at the foot of a high hill and stretches forward with a gentle slope towards the Eyre stream. On the other side of a bridge, the road splits into two parts. One goes gently to the left, rising up the valley, while the other heads straight up the mountain. Because the Eyre overflows, that is, floods, small detachments are positioned on the mountain peaks, with their posts set deep within the forest. The imperial troops are positioned here, forming two divisions behind a trench, with a battery placed on a hill in front of them. To the left of the road there are Hessians positioned in gardens, with small houses that have been burned down. Further left, after our command had moved in detachments through the forest, which is patrolled by Jaeger, light infantry, and hussars, an imperial detachment guards this flank at the village of Rérelon. Beyond, Osseville lies behind the Eyre, where... September 26th. The Hessian hussars were relocated. Behind us there is a stream called La Coussance, along which lie the two villages of Brabant and Brabancon. Both bridges are also occupied. The main road leads to Verdun, where on the 26th the dragoons were stationed, while the carabiniers were cantonized in the latter village. SM, probably referring to a commander or individual, moved to Vraincourt with the Garde du Corps detachment, and the Prussian detachment remained there as well. If you travel 1 hour forward from Clermont, you pass a village called Les Ilettes and the Côte de Bième. The entire forest here is called Bois d'Argonne, and on the mountain the main road splits. One path leads right to Saint-Menehould and the other straight ahead to Châlons. To the left there are routes to Saint-Mihiel and Mousson. This pass is reportedly monitored by an imperial corps, with Saint-Mihiel being particularly difficult. The forest here is also called Bois des Rois. September 27th. We, however, have declared a ceasefire, though the Prussians and others have not. We remain in a silent standstill. The French, instead of attempting a diversion behind us, as we had believed, have fortified Verdun, and it became clear that Dumouriez, the French commander of the large army, entered into negotiations with the Duke after his forces suffered a setback. General Prince of Hohenlohe, commanding the Prussian advance guard, encountered the French outposts at Hans. As soon as they raised the alarm, they were supported by the French army near Saint-Menehould, forcing the prince to retreat. However, the Prussian mounted artillery then delivered such a devastating canister fire to the advancing French cavalry that it is said the French lost over 2,000 men. The French are still in negotiations, but it is not officially confirmed. Today, our Prussian adjutant, Major von Ruckel, sent a flag of truce to Draus, asking for safe passage for the French troops from the camp at Ilettes to their post near Saint-Menehould. I do not know the response yet. Perhaps they have kept them as prisoners of war, as they had done with one of the Duke's men. What could the shots from the imperial troops mean? Just now, a deserter arrived, claiming that the enemy is planning something against us for the night. He also said they are very embittered against us, and meanwhile, at St. Menehould, they are cooperating with the Prussians. Furthermore, he reported that Dillon replaced Dumouriez, who had gone to Paris, and that he brought troops with him. The deserter also mentioned that the enemy lost 5 officers and about 40 men in total during our recent attack, either dead or wounded, September 28th. Still a silent standstill, as no official announcement has been made. Today, our Prussian adjutant, Major von Ruchel, sent a flag of truce to Drouet, requesting safe passage for the French troops from their camp at Ilets to the post at St. Menehould. I do not know the response yet. Perhaps they have kept them as prisoners of war, as they had done with one of the Duke's men. What could the shots from the imperial troops mean? Just now, a deserter arrived, claiming that the enemy is planning something against us for the night. He said they are very embittered toward us, and meanwhile, at St. Menehould, they are cooperating with the Prussians. Additionally, he reported that Dillon, who went to Paris, replaced Dumouriez, who was commanding at St. Menehould, and brought troops with him. The deserter also mentioned that the enemy lost 5 officers and around 40 men in total, either dead or wounded, during our recent attack. October 1st. Today we find ourselves retreating under the guns of Verdun. The news has spread that the Duke, due to a lack of forage and supplies, has been forced to retreat. His army is exhausted, and a direct assault on the French is no longer feasible. The retreat was inevitable if we wanted to avoid the possibility of Dumouriez's entire army falling upon us, cutting us off from Verdun. To cover our retreat, we made the enemy believe we were about to strike their left flank. To this end, 1,200 imperial troops moved toward Fleury, where 2,000 Democrats were reportedly located with the aim of neutralizing them. Colonel Dubai, however, took a different route, moving with our 2nd Battalion, Grenadiers, Cavalry, Wurmser men, and Hessian Hussars, to secure the right flank of the Imperial General and await further orders. Unfortunately, these forces were pushed back by the French, who attacked them unexpectedly. Colonel Dubai and his detachment found themselves in danger of being captured. However, through skilled maneuvering and the bravery of the Wurmser Hussars, they managed to avoid disaster. No significant losses were sustained, though the enemy pursued them aggressively until they reached the town. Meanwhile, our cavalry command had to cross a river near a village where Lieutenant von Lindau and 30 men had been holding a bridge to protect the colonel's right flank. The French stormed the bridge, resulting in 16 enemy casualties, either dead or wounded. The remaining soldiers, including Lieutenant von Lindau, were taken prisoner. Despite this setback, Colonel Dubai returned to our camp safely just as we were preparing to break camp. At 2 a.m., we began our retreat, positioning ourselves on the heights of the village of Regret, along the first bank of the Meuse, just before the citadel of Verdun. Our outposts had successfully withdrawn from Clermont without alerting the enemy. Our new position was on a high, round hill, surrounded by other hills covered in dense forests. The only open direction was toward the road to Clermont, where Prince Hohenlohe's forces had been stationed. October 2nd, Dillon advanced with the French vanguard, but we remained in our positions, prepared for whatever came next. October 3rd, Dumouriez returned to our old camp at Brabant, while the Duke visited our camp. The 1st Battalion of Prince Philippstol moved from Zet to Piat, and the troops from Eschwege moved from V to Bupvi. Despite the ongoing tension, we continued to maintain our position, ready for any developments. October 4th, I arrived with the command at Pipam. Around 10 a.m., approximately 200 Jäger withdrew into the forest across from us. They broke out with 2 small cannons and some hussar units, forcing me, along with a command of 24 Wurmser hussars, to retreat eastward toward O. Meanwhile, the Wurmser hussars moved from I to Itak to adjust our position. October 5th, continuous skirmishing persisted through the 6th. On the morning of the 5th, Lieutenant von Butler from the 1st Battalion of the Regiment of Hanstein arrived as a courier. He brought news of the fate of the city of Mainz and the dire situation in the county of Hanau, where French General Custine now held control. October 7th, an exchange of prisoners took place on our left flank. The Duke and Prince Hohenlohe visited our camp once again to survey our position. As a result of these discussions, a ceasefire was agreed upon, and negotiations began. However, it seems likely that this was merely a tactic to buy time and extricate us from our difficult situation. While all this unfolded on our left flank, the French launched an attack on our posts at May with considerable intensity. As a result, we had to send support, deploying a command of 200 men to assist in holding the position. Kellerman also advanced against our hussars and imperial outposts, but the engagement amounted to nothing more than an exchange of cannon fire from both sides. Whether we requested the ceasefire or it was offered by the French remained a mystery to us. However, I believe the latter to be the case, as around 5 a.m., French Jaeger attempted to overrun our command post in. Finding our troops alert, they instead sought to disable the 2 battery pieces stationed in N by firing from Kyung, where they had completed their own battery during the night. Our battery in N withdrew, while the one in S managed to silence the enemy guns. Shortly after, the Duke arrived and immediately sent Major von Heister to the French camp. Following extensive back-and-forth negotiations, a 24-hour ceasefire was agreed upon. Meanwhile, all other outposts remained engaged in skirmishes until about 1 p.m. SM hastily traveled to Hesse this morning to attend to his affairs there. Our situation was particularly dire concerning food and forage, especially since the French vanguard, under General Beaurepaire, was advancing on our left flank. They had already driven our foragers back from Y on the 2nd, but on the 3rd a successful foraging operation took place. However, by the 4th, we were under heavy pressure, making further foraging in the area, particularly here, impossible. We were preparing to attack the enemy despite having to leave our advantageous position and face a much stronger enemy in a more favorable position. However, the Duke recognized the potential consequences of a lost battle and thus negotiated another ceasefire. October 8th, our battalion moved to V on command, where we relieved the Grenadier Battalion of Eschwege, which then retreated to Z. At noon, a flag of truce arrived with a letter for General Kalkreuth, who had arrived with his vanguard on the 6th and was camped behind the Meuse, reinforcing us from this point onward. Our foraging operation had been protected on the 7th, 3 hours behind Verdun. I took the letter for delivery. We feared that hostilities might resume, which greatly concerned us, as our situation remained precarious. Since the 4th, our troops had been without tents, sleeping in the swamp, with only poor bread and almost nothing else to eat. We had been constantly alarmed, enduring very strenuous service, with nearly 30 francs per company. The poor condition of our artillery horses was another pressing issue. Barely 3 horses were available for each piece, and they were so exhausted from lack of forage and constant harnessing that they could hardly move the guns through the heavy soil. Furthermore, the relentless stormy weather had rendered our muskets nearly unusable. The Imperial and Prussian forces were not in much better shape. In Verdun, they were burying 30 to 40 men a day, though this was not the case for us, as our troops were better supplied. All the houses in the area were filled with the sick, but we were spared this fate. General Kalkreuth himself came to hold a conference with the French general. Never would I have imagined that a Frenchman would go so far in his dealings with his enemy. The entire event turned into a fascinating spectacle. There were countless spectators on both sides. After the two generals spoke for a while on horseback, between the pickets at Y, they dismounted. The French general then spread his white cloak on the swampy ground, and both generals sat down. It is likely that the French general dictated certain points that should serve as the basis for an accommodation. Whether these were the actual terms, or whether they contained something different, we never learned. Much remained mysterious to us. For example, when the Duke of Hesse withdrew, he marched away in broad daylight without a rear guard or side patrol, and was not disturbed by the enemy at all. A manifesto was issued by the French to the Prussians, offering friendship and requesting that they not interfere in their conflict with the Emperor. They seemed to apply the same reasoning to us, for already on the 2nd, Dillon sent Lieutenant von Lindau, who had fallen into captivity, back to our camp through one of his officers without any conditions. The letter included an attestation of his behavior and a note urging our commander to retreat, with the assurance that no obstacles would be placed in our path during the march. On our side, we had to believe that the French had no intention of engaging with us. We also had to admit that there might be something to the rumors circulating, especially the one that the Emperor had not sent the 150,000 marks stipulated in the Pillnitz Treaty for the war against France. Both courts were so strained that an alliance with France, as well as its recognition as a republic, might even be possible. This had been formally declared by the French since the 7th through the proclamation of their king. This time, we did not observe anything unusual other than the ceasefire having been extended, and that the king had posted himself at Grand Bras. However, the purpose of the ceasefire soon became evident. Our heavy baggage had already been moved on the 4th behind Verdun to an elevated position. The lighter baggage continued on the 9th, and horses were brought in for the cannons. The imperial troops defiled regiment by regiment through Verdun. That evening at 8 p.m., we received orders to sneak away as quietly as possible by 11 p.m. We carried out the retreat without being pursued by the enemy, and they allowed the covering command of 30 men from the other general to withdraw unhindered. However, they caught a patrol of 15 men from the Fusilier battalion who were taken prisoner. We took our position behind Verdun at Belrupt, while the French occupied the same position the next day. We believed we would have to stay there for a few days to protect the baggage. The Duke came to inspect our position, but upon receiving word that the enemy intended to occupy the Longuyon Pass from Thionville, which is a dangerous defile and would have cut off our retreat, the imperial forces quickly began their departure, as did we, at 8 p.m. that evening, acting as their rearguard. Our march proceeded along the main chaussée toward Longwy. 2 hours before reaching our camp, we had a rendezvous in a forest near dawn, after which we continued our march, passing through Estaing, which the imperial forces had thoroughly plundered during their passage. We stopped to rest around 5 p.m. on the 11th. By this time, the imperial forces, namely Prince Hohenlohe's army, had resumed their march, and we did the same. To cover their right flank, we posted ourselves in a forest near Simon for the night. October 12th. At 4 a.m. we resumed our march. We passed the imperial camp at location and made a rendezvous, continuing our march until we reached Martinfontaine. There, we took the left-turning chaussée toward Montmedy. October 13th. We posted ourselves for the night in a forest. This forced march aimed to outpace the imperial forces, as Kellerman had crossed the Meuse with a strong corps. When we departed for Longuyon on October 14th to occupy the heights of the pass, we found that General Kalkreuth, with the Prussian vanguard, had already established a position there. the enemy launched a very lively attack on the rearguard of the Imperial Army, but despite their efforts, the enemy could not make any headway. I had never seen the Imperial forces maneuver with more poise and skill, even though they had to hold their position until nightfall. The Longuyon Pass had been blocked due to the unforgivable behavior of our Prince of Philippsthal. Here is how it happened. When we heard about the engagement of the Imperial forces with the enemy, we posted our rearguard on the right and left on the passes. Here, the prince ordered his guns to be excluded in order to reload, but in Longuyon, almost the entire baggage of our army was delayed, as the steep mountain could only be ascended slowly. As the noise of the guns grew louder, many thought the enemy was already upon us. Even General Kalkreuth believed it, which is why he deployed forces and occupied all the heights. The wagon drivers, however, panicked. One ran over another. Many unharnessed their horses and fled, and many carts were left in the mud, looted. It was a dreadful sight. Longuyon was completely plundered in the chaos. A Prussian killed an Imperial soldier over this, and houses caught fire. Imagine the terrible wails of the inhabitants, combined with the screaming of our men and women, and you can get a complete picture of that miserable day. Horses, exhausted on the steep road, were run over, and we lost about 200 horses this way, not to mention much of the baggage. Some of our officers also suffered the same fate. With great difficulty we climbed the vineyards, rocks, and thousands of stones to reach the heights, as the town was impassable. Had it been anyone other than a prince, this recklessness would have cost him dearly. By 6 p.m. we finally reached our positions, having covered only a short distance. We were so exhausted that we collapsed into a deep sleep, which required our PKs to be especially vigilant to guard us, a responsibility I found myself in. October 15th. The baggage continued its journey toward Longwy. General Kalkreuth moved into a different position. Prince Hohenlohe the Prussian took his position, and the Duke arrived with the army at Châtillon-l'Abbaye. Clerfayt retreated to Brabant, where the enemy pursued him. October 16th. Once the entire baggage train had passed, we set off toward Longwy around noon, passing through the town to head for Thionville, and took up positions at Mexi, beyond the Cher River, covering the ongoing retreat of the Imperial forces. Kellerman closely followed the army and observed us from all sides, but did not interfere with our movement in the slightest. The Duke had always followed us and was in the camp we occupied on August 30th. His rear guard made contact with the garrison at Verdun under General Corbière, who had evacuated the fortress on the 12th. Despite this, Corbière continued his march without disturbance. He left behind 906 soldiers in Verdun due to a lack of wagons, but the enemy took the more mobile ones and transported them to Longwy. He also had to abandon much of the bakery supplies and other materials. The Imperial Corps, which had been observing the garrisons of Metz and Thionville, had to endure a heavy cannonade during its retreat toward Burgundy. It is unbelievable how much this retreat cost us in terms of men, horses, and wagons. Especially in terms of men, the Prussians suffered significant losses due to their inhuman negligence throughout the campaign. As for horses, we lost as many as they did, largely due to the lack of forage and the very poor roads. Each Prussian cavalry regiment had to contribute 150 horses for draft purposes, and we were required to do the same, yet the Prussians had 12-pounders and 2 ammunition wagons for every one that we had to leave behind. The Imperial forces fared better, as their preparations had been more effective, and their magazines were always stocked, allowing them to save our horses from death at Verdun. At Longwy, the Corps of Emigrants was formally dismissed. By the time we reached Verdun, some troops had already dispersed. They were of no use to us and had become a burden. We encountered them on all the roads, and many we later saw being sent back to the imperial armies as recruits. The majority, however, made their way to Brussels. Our baggage had long since been moved, so we continued to stay in bivouacs, which were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the now beginning cold nights. October 20th. We broke camp and crossed the Chier in the lower part of Longwy, where we spent the night in a bivouac at Dipach, our old position from August 29th. October 21st. We passed through Luxembourg, where we found the Prussian heavy artillery, along with a pontoon train stationed on this side of the city. On the other side, General Wallace had positioned the imperial forces who had marched from Lorraine. We had to spend the night, thankfully, without baggage and provisions, in the woods near Senningen, as we did in the past. Since we are now marching as an entirely independent corps, making our way straight home, and have not seen anything of our allies in the meantime, I cannot yet determine with certainty when Longwy was evacuated. October 22nd. We marched to our first quarters and our battalion arrived in Lelig, where we had our rest day on the 23rd, which was very beneficial for us. In this way, we stayed on the first bank of the Moselle and did not cross the river, as we had done on August 28th at Fire-Bemmechern, a pass which was currently being covered by 2,000 to 3,000 imperial troops, camped and quartered there. The main headquarters was in Trier. October 24th. We passed through a village on the Moselle called Eigel, just 1 mile before Trier, which is notable for an intact memorial column from the time of Caligula, dating back over 1,500 years. The column stands on a pedestal, and remarkable events from his history are carved in bas-relief on it in colossal size. I was detached to the staff of the 2nd Battalion at Ilezerod. The headquarters was at Salmerod. October 25th. Our entire 1st Battalion returned home, while the 2nd Battalion went to Unterscheidsweiler. On the 23rd, we had embarked all our artillery on the Moselle, but upon learning that scouting parties were active in the Hunsrück and that the enemy intended to occupy Koblenz from Mainz, we had to pull back the artillery. In an attempt to possibly drive back the French, we lost our rest day and marched again in column, with the hussars now taking the avant-garde alongside the grenadier battalions, while the cavalry formed the rearguard, which made a rest stop at Witt. The headquarters was at Sulzerath. October 26th. The headquarters was at Dungerheim, and our regiment arrived at Alfien, Greimersberg, and Massberg. That night, the hussars had to reach Koblenz, and the Prince of Philippsthal was transported there by wagon. October 27th. The entire regiment arrived at Pollock, while the headquarters moved to Koblenz, where the rest of the corps arrived on the 27th. There the 3 infantry regiments remained stationed, with 2,000 Trier soldiers occupying Krenbreitenstein fortress. The grenadier battalions were quartered in Koblenz, while the carabiniers were sent to Müllen and Bovenheim, the Leibdragoners to Rübe, the Hussar to Nauendorf, 1 company of Jägers to the valley, alongside the Prussian cavalry command with the hospital and bakery. Another Jäger company went to Weiss, the light infantry to Lai, and the heavy baggage to Metternich. October 30th. A command of 288 men was sent to Cartois, where they had to occupy 2 redoubts. The light infantry coming from Lai was tasked with a command on the road to Waldesch, where a blockade was set up. Many of those who had fled the city returned. Criminals and suspicious individuals were taken into custody. I rode over Schönborn's Lass to Neuwied to inspect the local factories. October 31st, I inspected Cartois and the surrounding area. November 1st, I visited the fortress, which was not in the best condition, as well as the palace of the Elector, which was very poorly furnished. I also visited several churches. However, everything can be excellently described in specific source. Rather than repeat or transcribe it, I will note that, despite the overall noble simplicity, the gilding of the pulpit, organ, and elector's pew could have been omitted. Additionally, the angel depicted on the ceiling, rising from the clouds behind the high altar, is poorly executed in bas relief. It lacks grace, the clouds have no light, and the sunbeams resemble wooden planks. November 2nd, the 1,000 imperial troops who had been withdrawn from Mainz arrived, having come via Cologne. November 3rd, the avant-garde marched, consisting of the 2 grenadier battalions, hussars, the Jager Corps, light corps, and their artillery, under the orders of Colonel Schreiber, across the Rhine. The hussars went to Heiligenrod, the Jager Corps to Holler, the light infantry corps to Horisen, the grenadier battalion to Montabaur, and the unit from Eschwege to Eigendorf and Eschelbach. The carabiniers were also moved across the Rhine to Rothenham and Immendorf to Canton. November 4th, the corps set out, marching to the left and crossing the Rhine. The Leibdragoner and the 1st Light Infantry Company formed the rearguard. Our regiment went to Gross and Klein Kolbach and Giro, while the headquarters was in Montabaur. The avant-garde was stationed as follows: the hussars at Offheim, the corps at Diekirchen, the light infantry at Dietz, Prince of Philippsthal at Els, and the unit from Eschwege at Limburg. These units were deployed to cover the Lahn Bridge, and as such they had a rest day, as did the light infantry company, until the corps passed on the 5th. They were then supposed to join the rearguard on the 6th. November 5th, the regiment arrived in Düren, Nassau-Stetten, 1st Battalion, Runkel, Hofens, Schadeck and Westerberg, 2nd Battalion. The headquarters was in Els. The small skirmish that our avant-garde, which had planned to quarter in Weilburg, had with the French there altered our route, which was heading to Weilburg. This not only affected our route, but also caused us to lose our rest day on the 6th, and we received the following orders. Each quarter must ensure it has the necessary draft animals. Since we could no longer requisition any, most of ours had died, and the others refused to move. We had to rely on the local peasants to transport our baggage, which had already started in Luxembourg. The entire baggage will proceed swiftly beyond Obermar at the Els River toward Langendenbach. Each regiment will send a detachment with 1 officer and 15 men. Once this detachment arrives at the mentioned location, it will proceed through Renneroth and Roth toward Herborn, where it will remain until further orders. All regiments will assemble tomorrow at their respective 1st Battalion headquarters. Colonel Schreiber will march with the avant-garde after the baggage has departed and head toward Ober-Diefenbach. The hussars will arrive there at 8 a.m. As soon as the avant-garde arrives, the hussars and the carabiniers will continue their march toward Langendenbach. Once this is done, a carabinier must notify the Leib regiment in Düren, as well as the headquarters. The latter will immediately march toward Oberhadamar, where the rest of the corps will rendezvous. We will come to Dorchheim, Heim, and Hungemeilen for quartering. The headquarters will be at Langendenbach. Today the Prussian army, which replaced us in Koblenz on the 4th, began its march. November 7th, we arrived in the Westerwald, and after quartering in Mühlen and Hohenrod, the area was very poor and harsh. There we had our 8th rest day. The headquarters was in Herborn. November 9th, the entire corps assembled according to the usual ordre de bataille beyond Herborn, a small town in Dillenburg along the Dill River, and we continued our march into Hesse. We arrived at Hott, Außen, Schirm, and Seelbach. November 10th. We moved into the following quarters as follows: Hussars, Bromhausen, Sickartshausen, Bellenhausen, Jäger, Nassenhausen, Ilchhausen, Winnen, Light Infantry, Nordeck, Wermetshausen, Furzhausen, Garde du Corps, Lora Damm, Prinz von Philippsthal, Oberwalgern, Holzhausen, Steinbach, Garde Grenadiers, Rötgen, Niederwalgern, Wenkbach, Garde Wolfshausen, Hachborn, Leidenhofen, Ebsdorf, Headquarters, Rösberg, Artillery Train, Dreihausen. Leibregiment Heskem, Borzhausen, Wittelsburg, Hausen, Ronhausen, Mölln. Grenadierbataillon auf Eschwege, Schweinsberg, Carabiniers, Rossdorf, Mardorf, Holzhausen, Leibdragoons, Kirchhain, Groß and Klein Seelheim. The Lahn Bridge was secured with a command detachment. It is regrettable that the detailed account of the military events in which Hans Ephraim von Stamford participated is no longer available. His regiment played a key role in storming Frankfurt on December 2, 1792, before fighting at Mainz and along the Rhine. On October 17, 1793, it marched with the 3rd Division of the Hessian troops, funded by the English, to the Netherlands. In February 1794, Hans Ephraim von Stamford left Hessian service and entered Dutch service. The exact timing of this transition is unclear, but it appears he joined the service of the Batavian Republic only after the French invasion of the Netherlands at the end of 1794. As commander of the 1st Jaeger Battalion, he fell in the Battle of Alkmaar on September 19, 1799, at the age of 32, fighting against the English and Russians who had landed on the North Holland coast.